"Shut up and stay still. You black people are always about to steal or pull some stunt, aren't you?" the officer shouted, yanking Camille Turner's arm just as she was helping an elderly woman who had slipped on the wet sidewalk. In his eyes, a black woman was a walking offense, but what he didn't know was that the woman he was cuffing had once served in the Marine Corps. When an entire system assumes you're guilty because of your skin color, even silence becomes an admission. "What do you think? What state are you in?" Camille Turner stepped out of the pharmacy with a small paper bag in hand. Under the gray sky of Eastbridge County, the drizzle fell as if it too were hesitating. She raised her coat collar and walked slowly along the slick pavement. It was an ordinary day, unremarkable, no reason to attract attention. Beneath the dark coat, her left knee throbbed with an old pain. The injury from Fallujah never quite went away, but Camille never complained. She never had. Her armor was silence, her weapon was observation, and her steps left no sound, even in civilian life. The corner near the bakery was still familiar, though she'd only been back in Eastbridge for a few days. A faint sound echoed ahead, the skid of shoes on wet bricks. An elderly woman with white hair, a frail frame, and a bag of greens slipped and fell near the bakery door. Without hesitation, Camille lunged forward, knee bent, hands catching the woman mid-fall. She placed a hand on the bruised elbow and checked her response. Edith Langley groaned but stayed conscious. Camille eased her against the stoop, keeping her head from the cold ground. It all took less than a few seconds. A sudden siren shattered the quiet bubble of decency. A patrol car braked hard in front of the store, splashing water onto the steps. Two officers got out, hands already reaching for cuffs. Camille looked up, still steadying the old woman. The older officer yelled, "Step away from her." "What are you doing?" Camille calmly replied, "I'm helping her." The answer was cut off by a shout, "Shut up and stay still. Black girls like you are always up to something, picking pockets or worse." Her hands were wrenched behind her back. Cold metal bit into her wrists as she was pulled upright, denied a chance to explain. Edith tried to sit up, her voice barely audible. "She was helping me. She didn't do anything wrong." A deputy turned to her, uninterested. "You're in shock. We'll handle this." A small crowd gathered. Phones were raised. A man tried to film, but was told to lower his camera. "This is an active scene. Step back." The air thickened. There was no space left for truth to speak. Camille didn't resist. Her eyes locked onto Edith's, clinging to that last piece of something decent. Rain fell steadily. Her wet hair clung to her forehead, and the dark coat melted further into the dim street. She was pushed into the patrol car. Before the door shut, she looked back once. Edith sat on the step, one hand gripping the grocery bag, the other cradling her aching arm. She shook her head slowly. No words, just a stare. Between them, nothing remained but powerlessness. The engine roared. Camille was pulled away from what should have been an ordinary act of kindness. But to the system, someone like her never qualified as ordinary. She was escorted straight to the rear wing of the precinct, where the closed doors said less than the accusations did. No introductions were offered, no instructions spoken, only the clink of locks and the drag of boots on tile. The interrogation room was bare, faint overhead light, a corner stained with old watermarks. On the table lay an open file, a pen placed precisely, as if everything had been waiting for a guilty party to sit in the chair. Camille sat, wrists still red from the cuffs. Her head rose as the door opened. Clayton Huxley entered, face calm, as if processing a routine formality. He took the seat across from her, opened the file, and read aloud, "Camille Turner, charged with assaulting a senior and obstructing law enforcement." His voice was flat, free of emotion. Camille met his gaze without flinching. Her voice came rough but firm. "I need to call a lawyer." Huxley chuckled, a cold flicker of amusement crossing his face. "You don't need one here," he said, placing his hand on a prepared statement. He slid the paper across the table, speaking in a tone that flirted with persuasion. "Sign this, and things go quickly. Minor charge, no record, a short stay." Camille looked at the paper, then back up. Her eyes cut through the man's facade. She shook her head. "I won't sign a lie." Huxley didn't press. He sighed, folded his arms, and leaned back. The door opened again. A deputy stepped in with a slim file. Cameras in the area glitched. No footage, a single sentence, yet in that room it carried the weight of judgment. Camille tilted her head toward the man. A faint crease formed at her eye. She had begun to see the full picture, every piece already placed before she entered the room. Huxley laced his fingers on the table. His tone turned grave, like a man stating doctrine. "We have a witness who saw you threaten someone. Your reaction to our officers shows non-compliance. You know, in towns like this, we're responsible for public safety." Camille remained silent. Her silence wasn't a retreat. It was resistance in its purest form. Eventually, she spoke. "Am I here because I helped someone who fell? Or because I'm black in a town that doesn't know what to do with that?" The question landed like a blade. Huxley paused. His eyes shifted. The deputy behind her shifted weight, his gaze wavering. The room fell into a vacuum of stillness. No one answered. Huxley closed the file, stood, and gave the signal. "Take her." Camille was lifted from the chair without struggle. On the way to solitary, she said nothing. Her steps remained steady and soundless. The door opened, yellow light slanting across her coat, revealing the faint corner of a military ID tucked in her chest pocket. A name crossed out from their system, but never erased from her dignity. In a place where truth bent to serve power, Camille understood she had just stepped onto the real battlefield. The transfer vehicle moved in silence, its tires grinding over the cracked asphalt like it was rolling across something unnamed. Camille sat in the back, her hands cuffed to a cold metal bar, eyes locked on the narrow mesh window ahead. No one had told her where she was being taken. No one explained why she was leaving the precinct just hours after her arrest. Everything unfolded as if someone had made a decision long before, and the rest was about forcing reality to follow a script. The gate of Eastbridge Correctional Unit emerged behind a line of withered trees. Coils of barbed wire layered over the gray block buildings, and the watchtowers loomed like mute sentinels. There was no sound but the clinks of locks, the thud of boots, and the indifferent stares of guards. Camille stepped down, hands still cuffed behind her back, her rain-soaked hair clinging to the nape of her neck. Her eyes scanned the surroundings as if by instinct, each breath tight but steady. At the intake unit, 2 female officers ordered her to surrender all personal items. She handed over the small paper bag of medicine, a hair tie, and a metal necklace. No one asked for her name. No one confirmed her identity. A printed form with a pre-assigned prisoner code was stapled to a file, reducing her name to the final 3 letters. Camille Turner became TNR 94B. An orange jumpsuit was handed to her, which she changed into in a cramped cubicle, with no lock on the door. As she stepped out, her knee buckled with pain, each step reminding her of a wound that never truly healed. She asked for medical assistance. A nurse glanced briefly, then turned away, jotting into the logbook, "Not urgent." Camille said nothing more. The voice that had once saved lives on patrol was now stored away, a weapon kept for the moment it mattered most. She was escorted down a long hallway, walls stained and ceiling cracked. Rows of steel doors lined either side, all closed. No one looked her in the eye. No one acknowledged the history she carried. The isolation cell was at the far end, its door opening without a sound. Inside was no mattress, no window. A cold white light fell from a single fluorescent bulb. The plaster walls were peeling, and the concrete floor was cold as stone. On a crude wooden table in the center lay a single sheet of paper titled "Voluntary Admission of Guilt." Next to it, a blue ink pen lay untouched. Camille approached and stood in front of the document. No one accompanied her into the room. The steel door shut behind her. There was no locking sound, but the heaviness in the air stretched every nerve in her body. She looked down and read each line. The charges were identical to what Huxley had read at the precinct: pushing an elderly person, assaulting an officer, obstructing a public servant. There was no space for explanation. Her right hand rested on her knee, the ache pulsing like a silent reminder that her body knew how to endure. Her eyes remained on the page. Her breathing was steady, but her mind was recording everything, not to argue, but to strike when it mattered. She memorized each punctuation mark, every typo, and the names signed at the bottom. Every word was a lie, and the more blatant the lie, the longer she stared at it. The pen stayed still on the table. Camille did not touch it. In the silence of the windowless cell, her training came flooding back. Wherever there's fabrication, someone must remember, and today, that someone was her. The door creaked open a second time that day, metal scraping against metal in a sound sharp and cold. A tall man stepped in, wearing a light gray shirt with a plastic ID clipped to his shoulder. His collar still held the fold of a military uniform, barely hidden beneath his civilian disguise. He didn't look around. He walked directly to the table, placed a thick file down, and sat across from Camille on a backless chair, barely an arm's length away. "Wesley Crane," he said evenly, his voice routine like a memorized equation. "I'm overseeing the legal processing of detentions here." Camille remained silent. Her eyes settled on the file. Crane unlocked the clasp, pulled out another statement, different from the one she'd seen before. The red stamp was faded, and the paper was creased at the edge. At the bottom was a signature slanted to the right, soft and unsteady, a forgery in cursive. He slid the document toward her. "Your signed confession. We already have it." Camille looked down but didn't flip the page. She asked, "Am I allowed to keep a copy?" The question caught Crane off guard, her voice too calm. He smirked, gave no answer. Instead, he leaned forward, voice slowing, sharpening. "If you cooperate," Crane said, "we might allow a phone call, maybe have a doctor check that knee. And if you're lucky, the hearing might happen this week." He paused, eyes fixed on her face. "But if not, you'll stay here. Your file will be completed, however we see fit. You know we can do that." Camille remained still. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head. Her silence gave no consent, no defiance. She had long known the tones of threat from barrels against her temple to sugar-coated commands. Crane's version, orderly, polished, polite, was the most dangerous of all. Crane checked his watch and stood like a man concluding a meeting. He closed the file, adjusted his badge, and walked out without looking back. The steel door closed behind him, this time with a hiss, slow and heavy. Camille sat motionless, staring at the space he left behind. A draft slipped through the ceiling vent, brushing her cheek. The damp odor of the wall crept into her lungs. Camille leaned down, removed the lining of her shoe where a neatly stitched seam hid a black thread the length of her hand, something she had carried since deployment, a last weapon for soldiers without rifles. She measured the bed's corner, then used the thread to mark sections of the rough wood. One mark for today, one for the new man, one for the threat just spoken. Each detail encoded by instinct, the way she once memorized enemy maps in the desert, where every footstep carried weight. She didn't need to prove her innocence with words. She needed time and memory to force the manipulator into light. In this room with no listeners, she bent down and stitched a short phrase into the bed frame using another strand of thread. Each symbol was a declaration of survival, a signal to herself that she hadn't been broken. 3 words, sewn in black, lay quiet beneath the flaking paint. "I'm still here." No one saw it, but Camille believed someone would be forced to look. Elijah Grant opened the case file on his desk, skimmed the first few lines, then clicked his tongue. The report had been marked as low priority, describing a black woman accused of assaulting an elderly person and resisting police. No surveillance footage, no independent witnesses, and the officer's account repeated vague phrases. The detainee's name was Camille Turner, with no listed address and no occupation noted. Elijah's first instinct was that this was just another minor arrest, likely to end in a plea deal or probation. His supervisor had handed off the case with a dismissive shrug. "Talk to her, convince her to plead, get it over with," the head prosecutor muttered, still holding a hot coffee. Elijah didn't respond. He had a habit of flipping to the last page first, reading the signature and final remarks before working backward. In this file, he stopped on the 3rd page, which read, "Held in solitary confinement. Reason, detainee safety." An unusual reason for someone with no prior record. He decided to visit her in person. No appointment needed. The cell door opened with a faint electronic buzz. Camille Turner sat in the corner, hands interlaced, eyes fixed on the only light slanting in from the doorway. Her hair was tied neatly at the back. The loose prison uniform only made her seated posture look more composed. Elijah stepped in and paused. She didn't look up or react. He approached slowly, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat. "I'm Elijah Grant, your appointed public defender," he began. "I'm here to ensure your legal rights throughout the proceedings." Camille remained silent. Elijah continued, "I'd like to hear your version of events, if you're ready to share." She looked up without delay. Do you believe the report? Her question was sharp, thrown like a blade between them. Elijah leaned back slightly, preparing a professional answer, but before he could form it, Camille added, "You don't have to say it. I know how this system works." Elijah didn't speak. Her eyes didn't beg for help, nor did they resist. It was the gaze of someone trained to take orders, someone familiar with situations that offered no real choices. He realized her silence wasn't defiance, it was a test of his patience. He nodded slightly, voice lowering. "I'm not here to push you. I'm here to find out what really happened." Camille narrowed her eyes, tilted her head. "Find out?" Her lips curled, not quite a smile. "Then start by looking at the footage they claim is unavailable." Elijah closed the file, his eyes still fixed on her. He wanted to ask why someone under arrest carried herself with such composure, but he knew it wasn't the time. Camille leaned against the wall, fingers laced again, her gaze distant like someone reviewing a sniper's angle. Elijah rose, nodded once, and walked out. As he left the jail, he didn't jot down a single note, yet Camille's image wouldn't leave his mind. Her stillness, her knife-sharp question, the way she pressed on something seemingly minor, whether or not he truly believed. Elijah no longer felt like he was handling a routine case. Something had been buried beneath those empty pages. Back at his office with daylight fading, he laid Camille Turner's file on the desk, a thin stack of near-blank pages. This time, he skipped straight to the personal info. No job listed, current address marked unknown, but at the bottom, a small note read, "VA registration number, veteran medical record." That line made his hand pause. A person accused of assaulting police, listed in the Department of Veterans Affairs system. He logged into the interagency database, navigated to the military network at the state level. A few keystrokes later, Camille's name appeared. Valid military ID. Restricted access. But even the visible parts were enough to make Elijah sit upright. The woman he had just met had served in 3 consecutive campaigns in the Middle East. He glanced again at the jail photo. That face, those eyes, her posture, suddenly they aligned like a folded battle map. Elijah grabbed his coat and left the office for the second time that day, heading back to the jail without notice. His voice was firmer now, as he asked to see Camille again. She was seated in the same spot, hands resting on the table, posture unchanged. Elijah sat down, this time without opening any file. "I checked the military database," he said. "You served." Camille neither nodded nor denied. She raised an eyebrow and asked softly, "Did you ever serve?" Elijah shook his head. She pressed her lips together, eyes narrowing slightly. "Then don't use law to measure memory." Elijah said nothing. There was no sentence fit for that moment. Camille lowered her head briefly, then met his gaze. She began to speak, her voice steady, each phrase like counting breaths between sand and blood. "Fallujah, 2nd year," she said. "Our unit was ambushed while escorting a medical convoy. I shot through 3 layers of wall, adjusted scope in 6 seconds, took down 2 targets behind mirrored shielding." Elijah leaned slightly, heart slowing with each word. Camille's tone wasn't narrative, it was survival. She didn't name anyone, didn't mention rank, didn't boast. Just precise actions where the weapon rested, the distance, the sound in her headset, the smell of gunpowder as if every detail lived inside her bones. Elijah now saw the truth. She wasn't simply a wrongly accused civilian. She was a soldier, stripped of her identity, now trapped in another battlefield, this one waged with lies and warped authority. When Elijah rose, he didn't say goodbye. Camille leaned back, eyes closed for a moment. He left the jail, returned to his desk, and switched on the lamp. At the top corner of a blank sheet, he wrote in firm ink, "Detainee is not a standard suspect. Signs indicate prior Special Forces service. Recommend immediate review of detention protocol." One sentence. But for Camille, it was the first sign that someone was finally beginning to listen. Elijah returned to the office later than usual. Most of the hallway lights were off, the coffee machine cold, the air between the cubicles heavy with something he couldn't quite name, maybe suspicion, maybe a premonition. He turned on his computer and entered his access code into the federal legal support system. Lines of stiff data appeared before him. Names, identification codes, medical notes, and insurance statuses. When he keyed in Camille Turner's medical file number, the screen instantly changed. A lock icon appeared with a red warning. Restricted. DOD classification. He sat still for a moment. Military-related cases had been mentioned during training, but he had never personally handled one. Camille had served in the military? That had never been mentioned in the arrest file, nor in any statement. Elijah picked up his phone and messaged an old contact, Kyle, who had briefly served in the Marines before switching to security tech. They once studied law together. Before going their separate ways, Elijah typed quickly, "Need to verify someone named Camille Turner, prior service. Just need to know if it's true." Within 20 minutes, Kyle replied. Her name was on the roster of a joint special unit deployed to Fallujah. There's an internal memo about the unit's only female sniper who saved a trapped team. Name, Camille T. Elijah thanked him and told him to stop there. The more he knew, the higher the risk of surveillance. He returned to his screen and entered a short note in the log. Possible link to combat unit. Verify veteran status. From an anonymous suspect, Camille had begun revealing a past forged in war zones. The next day, Elijah received an anonymous email with scanned images of a torn, faded paper file. The top line read, Turner, Camille, Maso 317, Marine Scout Sniper. Below that was a commendation section, including a combat honor medal. But further down, sections were blacked out, especially those listing mission details, discharge reasons, and her last assigned unit. He printed each page, laid them out under a light, trying to read through the redacted ink. Useless. Her past had been buried deep. But from what lay in front of him, Elijah didn't need further confirmation to understand. Camille had once stood on the front line, had lived and walked out from where others hadn't survived. And now, she was jailed for allegedly pushing an elderly woman. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the red stamp slanted at the bottom of the last page. The ink was crisp, like a reminder that some data sat beyond the reach of ordinary justice. In the dim light, Elijah set pen to clean paper and wrote a few deliberate words. This is not merely a criminal case, and for the first time, he wondered whether he was up against a structure long built in silence. The next morning, Elijah logged in, intending to check Camille's file again. The login page looked the same, but as he entered his code, the screen turned gray with a message, "Account temporarily suspended due to unauthorized access to classified system." His fingers froze above the keyboard. He had used this system for dozens of cases without issue. Less than 10 minutes later, the desk phone rang an unknown number, no area code. He picked up, but before he could speak, a cold male voice said flatly, "You'd better stop. If you want to keep your license, know where to draw the line." The call ended as abruptly as it came. Elijah stood, walked into the hallway, eyes scanning the corridor. Everything looked normal, but in his mind, pieces of doubt were fusing into a solid weight. He returned, reopened the paper file. With digital access cut off, he turned to the arrest records again, line by line. That's when he noticed what no one else had bothered to check. The incident report was time-stamped 3 hours before Camille was officially placed in holding. Filed by Wesley Crane. Elijah recognized the name immediately, the man who had entered Camille's cell with a pre-written statement. It was a pre-planned script. Someone had penned the conclusion and worked backward to make the facts fit. He checked the duty roster at Eastbridge that day and found Crane wasn't even scheduled. The alignment was too precise to be a coincidence. That afternoon, Elijah was granted a short visit with Camille. She entered the interrogation room, posture unchanged, gaze sharp as ever. He sat upright. No preamble. "Were you ever a witness in a military internal investigation?" Camille stared at him for a few seconds, then nodded. "I was summoned as a witness in a closed hearing about fraudulent logistics contracts in Iraq. A battalion commander was discharged. Within 3 days, I was transferred out of my unit. No explanation." Elijah asked nothing more. He understood enough. A decorated soldier's record is buried, reappearing in a small town with a questionable law enforcement history, then accused out of nowhere. This wasn't a chance. It was targeted retaliation. He returned to the office at dusk. In the faint light, Elijah quietly typed into the supplemental report, each word deliberate, as though entering it into evidence. Detainee was a witness in a high-level military investigation. Evidence suggests systemic retaliation. Redactions not for tactical secrecy, but for liability avoidance. He closed the file and locked it with a personal password. At that point, Elijah knew this case was no longer about a woman accused of a crime. It had touched something many preferred to ignore and few dared to name: Among dozens of names flashing past his eyes, one file stood out: Marcus Delaney, male, black, 35 years old, former infantry soldier. The recorded cause of death was suicide by T-shirt in solitary confinement in 2019. What struck Elijah was how the notes on Marcus's file echoed what he had just seen with Camille. Immediate solitary confinement upon arrival, no access to legal counsel within the first 72 hours, no visitation record, and a separated autopsy report missing from the internal database. He copied down the listed contact address, a suburban home owned by a woman named Lorna Delaney. The road leading there cut through a patch of dry, bare trees, ending at a weathered gray wooden house, resting still under the slanted afternoon sun. Elijah knocked once, then again. A woman in her 60s opened the door, narrowing her eyes at the stranger while clutching her sweater hem tightly. "I'm here about someone named Camille Turner," Elijah said, holding up his attorney badge. The name made her pause for a second, then she gave a slow nod. She asked no further questions, only opened the door and led him inside. The room was modest, laced with the faint scent of old lime wash and mint tea. Lorna sat across from Elijah, her hands resting on her knees. Her voice was steady, rehearsed, like she'd repeated this story in her mind for years, with no one ever really listening. Her son Marcus had served 2 tours overseas, returned with medals and post-traumatic stress. He lived with military discipline and neat habits, strict routines, stayed away from alcohol and conflict. In early 2019, Marcus was arrested for disturbing the peace after a brief argument at a bus station. The family was told he was under special supervision and unavailable for visits. 3 days later, she received a call from the jail informing her that Marcus was dead. The death notice said he'd hanged himself with a T-shirt, but when the body was returned, there was a large contusion at the base of his skull, a shaved patch on the left side of his head, and discolored skin around the neck that didn't look natural. She had once tried to sue, went to 2 local law offices, both of which turned her down. One lawyer bluntly told her, "No solid evidence. Besides, that name stirs trouble." Someone she knew in the system had once whispered a warning: "Don't push this further. They clean things up before you even know what happened." Lorna stood, pulled out a thick envelope from a drawer, and handed it to Elijah. Inside were letters, the death notice, a copy of the forensic report with a handwritten note: cranial hematoma, not in the official summary. Elijah froze when he reached the final photo. Marcus in uniform, dated 2012, standing upright, his gaze steady, expression composed and guarded. What struck him wasn't how striking the image was, but how familiar it felt. The eyes mirrored Camille's from the other day, eyes that had stared at death and never backed away. He closed the file, a tightness in his chest like brushing against a sealed verdict no one had dared reopen. Marcus never got to tell his side, and Camille, without someone to listen, could become the next name erased from the record. Elijah knew this wasn't the end. For the first time, he felt like he couldn't walk away. Lorna placed an old cardboard box on the table, its surface coated with dust and faint pencil marks blurred by time. She didn't open it right away. Her hands trembled slightly as they pressed against the lid, as if feeling her son's imprint. Elijah remained silent, watching her movements closely, knowing whatever was inside was something the system never intended outsiders to see. Inside were letters Marcus had written while imprisoned at Eastbridge. Most were yellowed, ink smudged in places from moisture. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, haunted. "Someone follows me at night. Some inmates are taken and never return. I suspect they cut cameras in a special wing. There's no sound, no light." Elijah read every page slowly, as if decoding the last cries of someone still alive, trapped behind cement walls. The last letter hadn't been sealed. The paper held only a few lines, ending abruptly but with unmistakable clarity. "If I don't make it out, tell someone what I saw." Elijah stopped cold. His throat tightened. What Marcus had written wasn't just a testimony. It read like a will from someone who knew he wouldn't get a second chance. Lorna sat at the edge of her chair, her voice distant, like narrating a dream. He wrote every night, hid them in his undershirt. Some I only found after everything was over. She spoke slowly, her gaze lost in the narrow window beside them. Elijah said nothing, letting her drift through memories long buried. The word alone repeated itself in her tone like a refrain. Since Marcus's death, she hadn't slept soundly. She dreamt of bootsteps on her porch, of bolts turning, of metal grinding. Once, her car's lug nuts were loosened at a gas station. An acquaintance from the coroner's office once visited, tried to speak, then fell silent. A few weeks later, he was transferred out of town. Marcus's death is like a scratch on this town's conscience, she said with eerie calm. They left it there, and no one dares touch it. When Elijah told her about Camille, she sat in still silence. No questions, no visible shock, only a soft reply. If she wore the uniform too, then it's not a coincidence. They don't want people like that left behind. Elijah placed his hand flat on the table, eyes locked. If you had a chance to bring one truth into the light, would you take it? The question carried no drama, but it weighed like a life or death choice. Lorna looked at him, her eyes narrowed, then nodded. I've lived half a life in silence. I won't let anyone else be silenced again. As Elijah stepped out of the small house, the sky had darkened. In his bag were files, letters, photographs, and medical records. But more than that, he carried the sense that someone had finally chosen to speak from the shadows. Two names etched in his mind now, like twin scars carved into the same stone: Marcus, Camille. And behind them, a system that always moved before the truth had a chance to speak. Elijah sat alone in the regional records room, the glow of the computer screen reflecting off his glasses. Before him was a database of arrest records from the past 3 years in Eastbridge County, each entry appearing like a fragment of a larger sequence he had yet to fully grasp. He filtered by race, place of residence, and detention duration. The figures that appeared stopped him cold. Over 70% of those arrested were black, despite the black population in Eastbridge being under 20%. Most were from outside the county, held for a short time, then released on the grounds of non-criminal behavior. No formal charges, no legal representation, and no questions asked about the administrative fees deducted from the state budget. He examined the data on detention, duration, and fines. Many were held for less than 2 days but still charged for processing, holding, and something called temporary management. Elijah had never seen budget allocation used this thoroughly. These people had no advocates, and none retained paperwork upon release. They left the facility as though they'd never existed, except for an internal code marked processed. He turned to the arrest location logs. Most incidents took place in border neighborhoods, areas saturated with public surveillance. But when Elijah requested footage from a recent arrest, the system returned recording error, data lost. He tried 3 other cases. Same outcome. All camera recordings around moments of conflict showed identical technical failure. A new pattern emerged. In more than 80% of the complaints about officer conduct, the reports were authored by the same trio of names: Huxley, Rollins, and Crane. No independent review, no internal audio, no attached video. Elijah redirected to restricted files. He found 3 flagged entries: Camille Turner's case, a detainee death in the jail the previous year, and a suicide from solitary 18 months earlier. All 3 bore the same administrative code, B42. He noted it and searched for its origin. No public information existed on the code's meaning, only that it allowed records to be quarantined from all external systems, including the state's internal audit unit. In silence, Elijah leaned back, eyes fixed on the blinking text. Beneath the columns of sanitized data and routine paperwork, he saw the shape of something larger. This was no clerical error, nor coincidence. It was a framework designed to target the easily dispossessed, built from the smallest pieces: a pre-filled form, a signal failure, an internal code meaningless to outsiders. He didn't know who Marcus Delaney was, nor the name of the man who died the year before. But he was certain Camille Turner wasn't the first caught in the spiral. She was simply the one who remained, the one clear-headed enough to stay silent and observe. Elijah reset the screen, printed the search results, and filed a separate folder titled Fixed Variables. As he stood, he knew the investigation was no longer about Camille. It was about every person who had passed through the system, erased without ever being known. The meeting took place in an old cafe deep within an abandoned industrial zone on the outskirts. Elijah arrived first, ordered a black coffee, and sat near a broken window, his hand resting on a leather-bound folder. The man arrived minutes later, slender, with wire-rimmed glasses, coat frayed at the shoulders. He introduced himself briefly. "I'm Quinn, used to manage the camera and data systems at Eastbridge Correctional." His voice was soft, but steady and clear. Elijah extended a hand. Quinn hesitated, then shook it lightly, his eyes scanning the room. Once seated, he pulled a printed email from his pocket and slid it across the table. Official notice of termination. They cited internal communication breach. "Truth is, I asked too many questions." He described the hidden loop in the data system. All footage from solitary, checkpoints, and interior corridors was auto-saved for 72 hours. After that, unless manually preserved, it was overwritten. No deletion order needed, no log left behind. Everything disappeared as if it never existed. Elijah asked who could request permanent storage. Quinn replied, "Only command staff and the tech team with B-42 clearance." Elijah brought up Marcus Delaney. Quinn paused, then removed his glasses and wiped them on his sleeve. He recalled reviewing footage that showed Marcus being restrained by 4 officers, 12 on his arms, 2 pressing their knees into his back. No audio, but Marcus struggled, then stopped moving. An hour later, the same camera glitched. When Quinn tried to retrieve the file, access was revoked. He submitted an internal request and was suspended 3 days later. 1 week after that, he was dismissed. "Elijah, I don't know what killed Marcus, but I know it wasn't suicide," Quinn said, his gaze direct, "and I've stayed silent too long." Elijah took detailed notes. Every piece matched what he had seen: B-42 codes, the 72-hour erasures, the same officers listed. Driving back to the office, Elijah sat in his car, the passenger seat stacked with scribbled notes. The model he saw was not momentary abuse, it was engineered, from tech to paper trail, from who got stopped to how evidence vanished. The targets were black, undocumented, legally unrepresented. They were held, subdued, and when complications arose, their traces vanished in what the system called temporary. State and federal funds given to Eastbridge weren't used for protection, but to maintain a fabricated image of stability. By lowering lawsuit numbers, erasing conflicts, and wiping footage, they polished a clean record on paper. Elijah now understood why Camille had been targeted. She was both an outsider and a survivor, someone who'd endured broken systems before, and more importantly, someone who refused to stay quiet. He reopened Camille's file, pulled out the initial report, and underlined the line, "Signal error, no data," in red. His hand stopped at the edge of the page. After a long pause, he added a sentence to the internal report, a first conclusion. "Evidence suggests systemic abuse of authority for financial gain, targeting vulnerable, unrepresented individuals." That report wasn't submitted immediately, but it stayed in Elijah's breast pocket for days after. Like a reminder, this was no longer about a single cassette, it was the mask of an entire system starting to crack. Lucy Langley sat slumped in the back seat of a silver-gray SUV, her legs dangling, brushing the worn-out fabric bench. She was waiting while her father picked up a grocery order from the shop next to the bakery. A soft breeze slipped through the slightly open window, carrying the scent of sweet pastries and early spring rain. Lucy rested her chin on the door edge, gazing curiously at the sparse stream of people walking by. When her grandmother, Edith Langley, the person Lucy adored, most stepped out of the bakery holding a paper bag filled with cinnamon rolls, Lucy smiled. That smile faded the moment Edith slipped and fell sideways on the steps. Lucy sprang up, her small hand grabbing the phone she always carried like a toy. She had been told that if anything happened to Grandma, or something seemed wrong, she should call an adult, or record it, as proof. So she turned on the camera, hands trembling as she captured a young woman rushing to help. From her backseat angle, Lucy couldn't hear much, but she saw the woman kneel down, check Edith's shoulder, touch her forehead, then gently help her sit against the wall. Lucy gripped the phone tightly when sirens blared and officers appeared suddenly. Within minutes, the woman was handcuffed and taken away while Edith was lifted into an ambulance. Lucy turned off the phone, her head spinning from how quickly everything had happened. That evening, in the warm, food-scented kitchen, Lucy told her father, Stephen Langley, about the video. Still in his police uniform, Stephen went still when he heard. He asked to see the footage, frowning as he watched. Without another word, he took the phone from her, deleted the video in a few swift taps, and returned the device. His eyes lingered on Lucy before he spoke in a hoarse voice. "This isn't something for you. From now on, don't tell anyone, especially Grandma." Lucy went to her room and quietly closed the door. She opened the pink-covered notebook her mother had given her and scribbled a few crooked lines. Though shaky, the words repeated clearly. She was kind. She didn't do anything wrong. Why did they take her? Days passed without mention of Grandma. Lucy was told she couldn't visit the hospital because it wasn't the right time. At dinner, when she asked if Grandma was okay, her mother stayed silent and her father frowned, telling her to just finish eating. Everything Lucy once believed that truth would be spoken, that good people wouldn't be hurt, was slowly being replaced by confusion and silence. One night, as she passed the hallway, Lucy overheard her father on the phone in his office. The door was barely ajar, his voice low but urgent. "We need to clean up the records before anyone else steps in. No recordings left behind. The store's footage is already taken care of." Lucy froze, ears burning. She didn't understand all the words, but phrases like records, clean up, and nothing left echoed through her like a frightening word puzzle. That night, she couldn't sleep. Rain trickled outside, forming cold drops on the windowsill. Lucy quietly slipped from bed, phone in hand. She tiptoed to the hallway, pressed her back to the wall near her father's door, and tapped the record button. The voice inside still spoke, filled with words she didn't fully understand, but her small heart sensed something deeply wrong. And if the grown-ups wouldn't fix it, maybe a child had at least by saving a piece of the truth. The next morning, Lucy sat at her desk, clutching her crayons. On a blank sheet of A4 paper, she drew the scene where Grandma fell, and the strange woman knelt down to help. Every detail was simple. Grandma's face was 2 circles and a purple scarf, the woman's hair colored in dark brown, the sidewalk bricks drawn in faint red. Beneath the picture, she wrote in messy handwriting, "She was kind." On her phone, Lucy still had 2 short audio clips. One was her father speaking to a man with an unfamiliar voice, mentioning that Camille's file has been redirected. The other was clearly her father, talking about the store camera being broken and how the old lady's testimony isn't reliable. Lucy didn't fully grasp what she had, but she felt strongly that silence would only make the wrong things stay wrong. She placed the drawing, printed transcripts of the 2 recordings, and a small handwritten note that read, "Please give this to someone who knows what justice means," into a sealed brown envelope. During recess, she handed it to her homeroom teacher. "Miss Amanda, please help me send this. It's really important," she whispered. Miss Amanda initially assumed it was a standard absence letter or a student's story, but when she opened the envelope during her lunch break, she paused. The childish drawing felt achingly real to adult eyes. The phrase, "she was kind," made her pause longer. When she played the first audio file, her face turned pale. Camille's name was clear. The male voice spoke of cleaning up records and handling the footage. In the stillness of the staff room, the recording cut into her awareness. She knew she couldn't ignore it. That very afternoon, she contacted an old friend, a federal attorney who once worked with a state human rights task force and securely forwarded the audio files. That friend was a former colleague of Elijah Grant. Less than an hour later, the files landed in Elijah's inbox, marked "Sent from a teacher, source unknown." An individual mentioned may be related to Camille Turner's case. Elijah opened the files before even removing his coat. The voice hit him with full force. Stephen Langley. He had spoken with the man once during an early inquiry. Langley mentioned cleaning the scene, leaving no trace, and worse, clearly dismissed Edith's testimony. The old lady forgets things. She's no longer legally sound. Elijah needed no more evidence. The original video had been deleted. Edith had been removed as a witness due to age, and it had all been dressed up as standard procedure. If that child hadn't acted, Camille would have been buried by the system with no one to notice. He stepped to the whiteboard and wrote 3 firm lines with a marker. "Lucy, 9 years old, deleted clip, truth from where no one expected it." Then he picked up the phone, called the Federal Inquiry Office, and said each word clearly, "I need Edith Langley summoned as a witness, immediately." In his hand was Lucy's crooked drawing, the smallest piece of evidence, but the most truthful he'd ever seen. The transport vehicle pulled out of the compound gates at dawn, the sky still caught between darkness and light. Camille sat in the back, hands on her lap, eyes fixed on the narrow window lined with metal mesh. No one explained anything, and no one gave her the chance to object. The transfer order had been signed the night before, stating briefly, "Exhibiting post-traumatic instability, requires special observation." Upon arrival at the psychiatric wing within the Joint Correctional Facility, Camille was escorted straight to the diagnostic unit. The corridor was long, painted white but stained with mold, and reeked of sharp disinfectant. The man in the lab coat who greeted her wore a badge that read, "Dr. Langley, Inmate Psychological Evaluation." The name made her glance pause. She had heard that surname somewhere before, but the memory had long been locked in a dormant drawer. She was led into a large examination room, low-ceilinged, bathed in glaring light. A long table, white plastic chairs, printed questionnaires. She was handed a list of questions like, "Have you recently heard voices without a source? Do you feel you're being watched? Have you ever woken up disoriented?" The doctor's tone was flat, asking not out of concern but like checking boxes on a form. She didn't react, only listened and observed. Her eyes caught the fine lines of the clerk's hand, the rhythm in which the phrase "unstable behavior" was repeated, and the synchronized glances exchanged whenever she gave brief answers. The signs weren't in the words, they were in the way the conclusion was being crafted before her eyes. In the first evaluation report, she skimmed a note. Patient exhibits minimal verbal engagement, avoids emotional responses, recommend extended observation for 48 hours. She put the paper down, unsigned. No one pushed her. They knew everything was being calculated another way. Back in the observation cell, Camille sat quietly at the edge of the metal bed, each question replayed in her mind like a training drill. She began to retain them the way snipers memorize coordinates: data grouping, repetition, noise elimination. Each word struck like a bullet against her awareness. She marked the 3 behaviors they were anchoring to shape her file: withdrawn, non-compliant, detached from reality. Words that could erase her name from the witness list in a single sign diagnosis. Camille knew what was being orchestrated. Once labeled unstable, all her testimony would be discredited. Every truth she carried would be dismissed as delusion. Every night she stood watch in the desert, every shadowed mission she followed, had trained her with one reflex: never let someone else rewrite a story you're still alive to tell. Light slanted through the frosted bars. She closed her eyes, thinking of Elijah, of their brief conversation when he last left the facility. His eyes had not yet been certain, but they were beginning to see. Then a name surfaced in her memory, a man's voice yelling over artillery fire. "You've got the steadiest nerves in the unit, Turner." Dr. Jonathan Reese, the one who had repaired the nerve in her left knee in Iraq. Camille opened her eyes and whispered his name into the sterile room, like a signal sent from a place thought forgotten. She still remembered, and Memorino one had touched that yet. The call about Camille's transfer came at noon, while Elijah was reviewing the previous intake notes. The switchboard clerk spoke briefly, citing internal medical recommendation. Refusing to elaborate, he hung up with a chill, as if a blade had sliced through the fragile thread of logic he was weaving back into the case file. Elijah knew this was no routine move. He dove into the military health archives, pulling every record from Camille's service years, cross-referencing treatment periods. Among hundreds of names, one line made him stop. Reese, Jonathan, MD, Fallujah Campaign. Tracing the military ID, he located Reese, now serving as a consultant for a veteran support program. Without delay, Elijah called directly. The voice on the other end was calm, but shifted the moment it heard the name Camille Turner. After brief verification, Reese requested the most recent psychological assessments. She had a mild injury, yes, but mentally she was always stable, arguably the most composed post-operation. If that report says otherwise, it's either incorrect or manufactured, he stated. Elijah closed his eyes for a few seconds. A knot had been untied. He sent a formal request to the prison's legal office to halt any official medical conclusions. Alongside it was a petition to investigate the psychiatric psychiatric diagnostic process at East Bridges Detention Facility. This time, the name on the request wasn't just a young public defender's. It carried the authority of a campaign-level military medical advisor, backed with credentials to serve as a counter-witness. Within 24 hours, an emergency interdisciplinary panel was formed, including civilian health officials, military representatives, and independent legal experts. Elijah submitted all archived notes, the repeated language, the subtle coercion into behavioral traps, and a cross-analysis of Reese's statements. The newly established medical file was frozen. Any further evaluations would be subject to review. Camille was returned to her original cell block. The escort team trailed behind in silence. As she walked down the hallway, her gaze stayed forward, stripped of the earlier weariness. Her steps remained measured, each footfall syncing with the cold floor. At the door, she paused a few seconds, looking into the emptiness ahead. For the first time since her arrest, her eyes did not brace for defense. They confirmed something. A corner of the system had flinched, subtle but real. She turned toward the light seeping through the door slit and said in a low, firm voice, "If you want to convict me, you'll have to outrun the truth first." No one responded, but the walls around her had just lost a piece of their grip. At the far end of the corridor, Elijah stood at his office door, watching Camille's figure vanish behind the heavy gate. He understood. This was no longer a defense case. This was the opening move. Elijah sat alone in his office, the glow from the screen casting light across scattered pages on the desk. He reviewed every detail Camille had mentioned during their last meeting. Fallujah, combat medic work, shrapnel in the knee, a doctor with a northern accent, and handwritten notes in the file. Those fragments of memory hadn't left his mind in 3 days. On the final night, he matched a name to Camille's information. Dr. Alden Strauss, a military physician who had retired after serving in the Middle East, once part of a high-level tactical support unit. He traveled nearly 300 miles to a small town where Strauss lived in seclusion in a wooden cabin near the forest edge. The gate was unlocked, but the doorbell didn't work. Elijah knocked 3 times. Silence. On the 4th knock, a tall man in his 60s with graying hair opened the door. His eyes were sharp and guarded. "I don't buy anything," he said bluntly. Elijah slowly held out his credentials. "I'm here about Camille Turner." Strauss's face changed subtly. His eyebrows lifted, then lowered, and the alert gaze shifted, as if unlocking a drawer long sealed. He invited Elijah inside, poured 2 glasses of water, and sat across from him without speaking for nearly a minute. Elijah waited. Finally, Strauss said, "I've never seen a soldier maintain composure like Camille under fire. There was a time the forward post was hit by mortars. I thought I'd be writing 3 death reports." She bandaged her own leg, then pulled a wounded man out of an armored truck. Elijah nodded slightly, allowing him space to continue. Strauss recounted that when Camille was brought to the field medical unit, her leg was bleeding, her breath heavy with cold shock. They examined her, located a fragment in her left knee, but it hadn't damaged nerves. A preliminary psychological assessment had accompanied the physical report, signed by Strauss himself. He stood, went to a back room, and returned with a worn gray folder. He placed it in front of Elijah, without a word. Inside was a report from that year, printed on military paper with verification stamps and his signature. At the bottom of the page, a handwritten line in black ink read, "No signs of instability. Psychological response under extreme conditions. Highly stable." Elijah read each line carefully, then looked up. Strauss exhaled slowly, eyes heavy. "They told me once not to get involved if anything ever came up about Camille. I thought I'd forgotten that warning, until you said her name." Elijah held the folder tightly. Strauss didn't need to say more. In that quiet wooden room, the truth was already present. A soldier who had saved others, evaluated thoroughly in both body and mind, was now dragged from civilian life and locked in a place where truth held no weight. Before Elijah left, Strauss tore off a copy, stapled it neatly, then added a handwritten line at the bottom, "Fully reviewed, no mental health risk." He folded it carefully and handed it over. "This is what I can give." Elijah stepped outside as twilight settled. The forest wind brushed his collar, branches cracked faintly in the distance. He paused at the steps, staring at the page in his hand. It wasn't a legal document in the usual sense, but a testimony from the only person who had seen Camille in conditions close to hell, and he had chosen not to stay silent. Elijah folded the file and tucked it into his coat. This time, he wasn't returning with more questions. He was returning to act. The message arrived on a Monday morning. Elijah had just set down his coffee when the email alert chimed. The subject line was simple, about the recording from Westlake Elementary. It was from an investigative journalist in Atlanta, Ann Holloway. The message was brief, with an attached audio file and a link to a report published less than an hour earlier. Elijah opened the file. A child's voice came first, soft and hesitant, followed by a sharper adult voice. "Camera taken care of yet?" a man asked. The voice was unmistakable. Stephen Langley. Another sentence followed. "That girl talks too much. Wipe it clean." The old lady's starting to mumble too. The tone was curt, commanding, and deliberate. Elijah stopped the playback, eyes still fixed on the screen. At the same time, social media exploded. The hashtag #JusticeForCamille surfaced on Twitter, then spread across veteran communities and legal forums. A child's sketch by Lucy, showing her grandmother falling and Camille catching her, was shared widely with the caption, "She's telling the truth." Comments flooded in. Who is she? Why don't people believe a child? If this is true, how many more are being locked up for the wrong reasons? In Eastbridge, initial whispers moved quietly through circles of teachers, parents, and silent veterans. They didn't speak aloud, but something shifted in their eyes. A mother wrote on the school bulletin board, "I believe my daughter," because she saw what grown-ups pretended not to. It wasn't signed. The principal removed it by noon, but the message had already sown doubt. Elijah sat before his evidence board, seeing the pieces fall into place for the first time. He drew a red line from Camille's photo to Lucy's, then to Dr. Strauss's report. A picture emerged. Camille wasn't arrested for an action. She was arrested for a memory. The system had prepared both the charges and the psychological narrative before she even entered the cell. The truth had been compressed, buried, until a 9-year-old child noticed something didn't add up. He drafted a petition to the state court requesting an early hearing, attaching all verified medical records and the authenticated audio file from the investigative team. No immediate reply came, but Elijah knew he had carved the first crack into the wall they'd built around Camille. On the board, he pinned 2 new notes beneath the case heading. The first, in blue ink, "No psychological disorder, confirmed by military doctor." The second, written in a left-handed slant, "Truth spoken by a 9-year-old child." Neither had exclamation marks. It was their quietness that made people pause. Outside the window, the rain began to fall. Elijah stood and pulled the curtain closed. In that small room he felt, for the first time, that someone had truly stepped toward Camille. Not with a gun, not with a robe of the court, just a child, brave enough to say what adults wouldn't keep. And from today, Elijah knew he was no longer working alone. Ryan Ellis stood silently in the corner of the briefing room, surrounded by the steady voice of the team leader, reading out shift assignments and incident notes. The weekly meeting was brief as always, but one name made him look up: Camille Turner. The woman is currently held in solitary confinement, labeled as uncooperative, defiant, and a potential threat in court. For most of the veterans in the room, she was just another name on the sheet, but for Ryan, her name struck a beat out of rhythm among the orders. He quietly returned to his desk, his mind drifting from the document on the screen. That name wasn't unfamiliar. Neither was her face, which emerged suddenly from a dusty memory: the burning drill field in Arizona, where he had nearly been expelled from tactical rifle training. Ryan vividly recalled that dry, windy afternoon. He'd lost control of his M4, stumbled, and lost balance mid-aim. Before the instructor could turn around, someone stepped in, steadied him, and wrapped a bandage around his shoulder. She never asked his name. She didn't smile or scold. She just tightened the bandage and said in a calm, low voice, "A real soldier doesn't retreat before knowing what they're facing." Ryan hadn't understood it fully then, but that line followed him ever since. Camille didn't stay long with the unit. Some said she was deployed, others claimed she didn't fit into the rigid system. But Ryan never forgot the way she sat silently during breaks, cleaning every part of her rifle, her eyes scanning spaces no one else noticed. And now, the woman who once held a storm behind steady eyes was listed as detained for assault and obstruction. That entire afternoon, Ryan scrolled through the internal bulletin, staring at the detention map with a growing weight in his chest. Camille's name was marked Red High Surveillance, with notes like unresponsive, no contact, no shift transfer requests. He wanted to believe there was a mistake, but in his years of service, he'd never seen anyone receive that classification within days of detainment unless there was a political motive. While at the checkpoint, Ryan asked an older officer quietly, "Has Camille Turner caused any trouble in the facility?" The man squinted, didn't answer right away. After a pause, he muttered, "She's not the kind you mess with, trust me." Ryan nodded instinctively, but the words tightened his stomach. Holding his shift notebook, he glanced through the frosted glass toward the hallway leading to solitary. He knew he was caught between two forces, a system nudging him to look away, and a memory that refused to fade, about someone who helped him stand when no one else even noticed. The briefing had long ended. The hallway lights flickered weakly. Ryan remained in place, fingers clenched around the notebook. One thought repeated in his mind more clearly than anything else. Camille Turner wasn't a prisoner. To him, she was a witness, and maybe the final piece of a truth he hadn't dared to name. The recording began with a faint radio crackle, then Crane's voice came through louder than usual. "We need to shut her up before some vet recognizes her." A pause followed, then Huxley's tone, calm and detached. "She's a soldier, but here she's a number." That sentence echoed in Ryan's ears again, as he replayed the file alone in the break room. The words were short, cold, precise. No laughter, no curses, just the raw clarity of organized power. He had enabled the radio recording days earlier, after overhearing a strange exchange during the night shift. Once he learned Camille was under special surveillance, Ryan couldn't stay still. The system around him began to reveal signs of a hidden order where truth was sorted like evidence and people became codes. That file was the first piece he truly held a simple statement, exposing a deeper intention. Camille wasn't arrested for wrongdoing. She was targeted to be silenced before her memory disrupted the system's course. That evening, Ryan prepared a brown envelope. Inside was a USB with the recording and a handwritten note, the letters leaning slightly left as if the writer's hand was trying not to tremble. "Don't trust the report, trust the voice." Wearing a mask and a cap, Ryan drove to the local courthouse in civilian clothes. The envelope slipped into a narrow slot of the legal drop box used for anonymous submissions. He didn't look back. Elijah received the envelope the next morning. First, he assumed it was another junk submission until he opened the USB and listened to the full recording. His body froze for several seconds after the final line. He didn't need voice authentication. He had reviewed enough internal case files to know exactly whose voices those were. Crane and Huxley, no doubt. The recording was duplicated and printed twice. One copy was filed under the internal evidence folder, red-labeled, secured in a private cabinet. Elijah typed an additional line at the bottom, confirmed conspiracy to isolate witness, immediate protection required. That sentence was like a white stripe cutting through the dark, thin but clear and unerasable. For Ryan, things began to shift. His shifts were shuffled constantly. One day, he was assigned to patrol distant zones outside town, the next to inventory duty. One night, he was randomly called for a personal bag search without prior notice. His performance file was suddenly flagged for review, without explanation. More glances followed him in the break room. Silence grew around him like a cold armor. He didn't argue. He filed no complaints. Each time he passed the solitary unit, his steps halted at the steel door's edge. He stared through the glass into the dim space where Camille Turner remained held. The woman who once lifted him up, wrapped his shoulder, left without a name, and now stood alone against what he used to call justice. No one knew they'd met. No one knew what he'd sent. But among the dozens of footsteps that echoed down that corridor, Ryan's gaze, each time he paused before that barred window, said everything. "I still owe you one moment of standing tall, and this time, I'm not backing down." Elijah sat in front of his laptop, the light from the digitized case file reflecting faintly off his glasses. His eyes paused on a faintly marked line, Direct Commander, A. Cross. The name wasn't one he recalled from any commonly referenced list. A quick check through a veteran network revealed the reason. Adrienne Cross was one of the few black female colonels to have commanded a combat unit in Kandahar. More notably, she had disappeared from all public channels after 2021. A call came in from an old military contact. Elijah picked up, greeted by a voice shaped by storms. "This is Adrienne Cross. Camille Turner once saved my life. If they're trying to bury her, I'll be the one to pull her out." She hung up without waiting for a reply. That same day, Elijah compiled a file, a legal summary of Camille's arrest, medical images of her old wounds filed in military records, and a copy of the internal findings from the East Bridge jail incident. He sent it through a veteran channel, knowing he had awakened a force not of the justice system, but of military honor. Within 3 days, veteran-linked media outlets began reporting. Headlines spread across social media. Colonel Adrienne Cross demands DOJ investigate urgent arrest of Camille Turner, decorated markswoman and combat service medal recipient. The story quickly caught fire, especially among military and veteran communities. People began sharing old footage of Camille during award ceremonies, rare clips of her bowing to receive medals against the backdrop of the national flag. Elijah watched in silence, fully aware that the case had now grown far beyond a small-town scandal. In Eastbridge, the atmosphere shifted. Camille's cell was searched twice in one morning. A medic was assigned to conduct a spontaneous examination. Hallway personnel were quietly rotated under a revised schedule. In a tense meeting at the police station, Huxley gripped the freshly printed bulletin in his hands, eyes scanning the room. His voice was firm. "No one talks to the press from now on. We'll handle this another way." That afternoon, a short audio recording appeared on a minor local media outlet, accompanied by a provocative caption. Even Camille Turner's former commander once questioned her stability. The clip lasted only a few minutes, just long enough to plant doubt. A woman's voice, allegedly Cross's, spoke coldly. "Camille was a liability to the unit, emotionally unstable, prone to escalation. I once considered pulling her from the mission." Though slightly distorted, it sounded authentic to the untrained ear. Elijah frowned upon hearing it. He accessed the military's audio archives, comparing the clip to verified samples of Cross's voice. The difference was subtle but present. More crucially, the timestamp placed the clip within a period when Cross had been hospitalized following complex heart surgery. Elijah knew that without concrete evidence, public opinion would shift exactly as Huxley intended. He began drafting a message to Cross, but she had already acted. A sealed military envelope appeared on his desk the next morning, containing transaction records linked to Dwayne Huxley, a defense contractor previously suspended for corruption during the 2016 campaign. On top was a note in Adrienne's firm, neat handwriting. "Clayton Huxley's cousin. Turner reported his fraud directly. That's why they're trying to erase her." Elijah's hand clenched slightly. The curtain had to be pulled back, and the person doing it wasn't a lawyer or a journalist, but someone repaying a debt a life owed through the only method the military's code of honor allowed, by exposing the truth. The next audio clip sliced through Elijah's phone like a blunt blade. The same cold female voice delivered each word with surgical precision. She was unstable, a threat to group safety. The clip, uploaded to a niche YouTube channel focused on military affairs, soon went viral. A local radio station replayed it with a definitive comment. Even her commanding officer couldn't trust Camille Turner. "This isn't racism, it's about real danger." Elijah leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen. The cadence, intonation, it was close, too close. But something felt off. He opened the file's metadata, checking creation date, editing software, and source storage. The data appeared, created the 5th of March, recording device, untraceable. He squinted, grabbed his phone, and called Walter Reed. After several rings, Cross's attending surgeon answered. Tired but certain, he confirmed. She was admitted late February, operated on March 3rd. Post-op recovery lasted at least 5 days. She was unconscious for the first 2. The audio was fake, technically unsophisticated, yet potent enough to mislead those unwilling to fact-check. Elijah forwarded the clip to an acoustic analyst at Georgetown University while preparing a medical report to refute the timing. Meanwhile, Adrian sent him a nearly 40-page document, military sealed. Elijah opened it, his eyes landing on a name, Dwayne Huxley. The report detailed an internal investigation into Dwayne Huxley, a contractor who once supplied gear to Middle East operations. Camille Turner had filed the first report, accusing Dwayne of delivering substandard equipment and inflating logistics costs. The case had been buried until a soldier died from a device malfunction. Camille testified, resulting in Dwayne's removal from military contracting. But without more evidence, he was never criminally charged. Dwayne was Clayton Huxley's cousin. The connection was as obvious as blood on a shirt collar. Elijah sat still before the file, every puzzle piece falling into place with brutal clarity. Camille's arrest in Eastbridge wasn't random. It was the outcome of a vendetta legitimized by power, uniformity, and a system accustomed to silencing the defiant. He called Cross again. Her voice was calm, steady as glass at the bottom of a cup, yet something had cracked beneath. I knew he wouldn't forget, but I didn't think he'd drag the entire machine down just to smear a soldier. Elijah's response carried no doubt. This isn't a mistaken arrest. It's a calculated military vendetta, camouflaged in police blues. She paused for a moment, then replied with quiet finality, like issuing an order. I'll send the full records from that campaign. Everything Camille did, everything she saved, everything she endured. If they want to erase her from truth, I'll carve her name into the record of history. Before hanging up, she added one last line, sharp and steady. Don't call this a favor. Call it justice for a soldier abandoned by her own country. The documents from Walter Reed arrived in a sealed envelope bearing the signature of the department's chief physician and a detailed medical log. Elijah turned each page, pausing at the vital signs chart and notes from the attending nurse. Cross had undergone a complex heart surgery and was kept under controlled sedation. For the entire first 3 days, she was intubated and incapable of speaking, moving, or processing stimuli. The medical records were too clear to be disputed. He forwarded the entire file to an audio expert at Georgetown University, requesting an origin analysis of the circulating recording. The results returned earlier than expected. The audio was separated into 3 voice layers, a clip from a television interview 5 years ago, a portion of a congressional testimony, and a background sample from an internal training file. Each fragment had been meticulously spliced together to create the illusion of a continuous voice. The final conclusion stated it was a deliberately synthesized audio product. Elijah chose to release the information through the National Veterans Media Channel, a platform he trusted to remain uncensored by federal entities or local broadcasters. The post immediately split public opinion. Half of the viewers reacted with outrage, calling it an honor purge to clear the way for deeper investigations. The other half remained cautious, suggesting Cross might have said that in another context. No one dares fabricate stories about the military. What caught Elijah's attention wasn't the online debate, but a brief comment beneath one analytical post. Then who authorized the release? Check the paperwork. He reopened the dismissed complaint files related to Eastbridge Prison from the past 3 years, focusing on those closed without a clear reason. The termination forms shared one detail, the signature, N.V. Mercer, with the title, State Judicial Liaison Supervisor. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Elijah had seen it often but never questioned it. Curious, he cross-checked related documents in the internal system. Every file involving Mercer bore the same anomaly. No specific date, just a circular stamp and a single signature. The issuance time didn't align with any electronic record system. Each document seemed to appear from nowhere, formalized without a traceable origin. Elijah arranged a meeting with a former administrative worker from the state judiciary office. They met at a cafe near the train station, her hand clutching a cold plastic cup, eyes watching the street. When he showed her a scanned copy of Mercer's signature, she nodded immediately. I've seen that name a few times, especially on papers linked to private prisons, but it's strange no one's ever met him in person. No one knows which floor he worked on. Elijah asked again carefully, has anyone ever wondered why his name appears on every case dismissed without cause? She gave a quiet laugh, like someone who had thought it through long ago but learned to stay silent. Of course, but in our office, some names are best left on paper. Dig too deep and you'll fall right out of the system. Her response made Elijah leave the cafe with his heart pounding. Mercer wasn't a persona, he might be a constructed identity protected by something more dangerous than the police, an interagency mechanism built to legalize misconduct. He opened his phone and sent a short message to Adrian Cross. "I don't think we're just up against a town anymore." The reply came quickly, as sharp as a blade. "I know, and if Mercer is real, he never signs anything without being told to." Oh, Elijah accessed Georgia's state personnel database, typing in every possible variation of the name N.V. Mercer. Every search returned the same result: no records found. No employment file, no tax file, no professional license. A name that appeared on legal documents didn't exist in the civil service system. He traced back through financial logs, budget transfers, and state audit reports. Each went silent at Mercer's name, as if erasing him was intentional. A 2017 document caught his eye. It was a partnership contract between Eastbridge Prison and a corporation abbreviated as Vertex Secure Systems, specializing in personnel and facility management for private detention centers. At the end of the contract was a signature and stamp reading, N.V. Mercer, State Judicial Liaison Supervisor, with a return address, not to an agency, but to an encrypted mailbox tied to the Justice Partnership Initiative, a little-known joint federal-state program aimed at optimizing correctional budget efficiency. Elijah flagged the document, sensing every word was both evidence and fuel. Justice Partnership Initiative sounded like reform, but the accompanying budget line told a different story. A large portion of its operational funds were channeled through secure pathways, with no named approver, all bundled under a single tag: special authorization. Mercer was no longer a person, he was becoming a symbol, a placeholder for a quiet power block, managing detention, related decisions, handling complaints, and laundering wrongdoing into legitimacy through an invisible seal. Elijah flipped to the budget sheets, tracing the state's funding to Eastbridge over the past 7 years. He discovered that the enhanced arrest for funding optimization model had been tested at 5 different locations, with Eastbridge as the first. Each time the arrest rate exceeded targets, state security funding increased proportionally. The detainees were primarily black, most without resources for private counsel. Officers were rewarded based on case closure rates within 30 days. Elijah studied the financial flow chart and understood Camille was never the center. She was a selected link, targeted for doing the right thing at the wrong time. A report on Camille's prior whistleblowing during a military campaign connected to Dwayne Huxley was stored in the military database, its timeline suspiciously aligned with Eastbridge's arrest quota surge. Camille became an ideal target, a soldier with a history easily painted as volatile, a known critic of corruption, and most of all, a deterrent symbol to those still willing to speak out. Back at the office, Elijah covered the wall with pinned documents. He added photographs of Clayton Huxley, Dwayne Huxley, Adrian Cross, Mercer, audio clips, budget reports, and unsigned paperwork. Red threads linked courts to police, contractors to oversight agencies. The shape of a dense, closed network emerged. Within it, lawyers, officers, vendors, and financial supervisors functioned like neurons in a system where no one accepted blame. Elijah stood before the board, eyes fixed on a photo of Camille in uniform, her tilted smile and sharp gaze unchanged from the day he first saw her at the prison. He whispered to himself, slow and steady, "Camille is the arrow. This system fears where she was aimed." Elijah printed each page of the death file on Marcus Delaney, white paper, dark ink, a font so crisp it felt clinical. Every line, every heading was laid out with the precision of a protocol that tolerated no deviation. That precision itself raised suspicion. Real forensic documents often bear traces of human handling, handwritten edits, blue ink corrections, and side notes from technicians. This file had none. It was spotless, perfect in a way that felt fabricated. The most suspicious detail lay in the file's metadata. Elijah asked a military technician to trace the timestamp of the digitized version. The creation date was 3 months ago, exactly when Camille Turner had been brought into Eastbridge. This file concerned a death that had occurred 2 years prior and should have been digitized early on. This update was no coincidence. Medical records showed Marcus had a sedative concentration in his blood twice the prescribed limit, yet there was no record of medication being administered. The treatment log was entirely blank, and the preserved blood sample had been marked as routinely destroyed. Elijah didn't need to be a forensic expert to know this defied all protocol. In custodial death cases, all samples must be retained for at least 5 years. This wasn't a clerical error, it was intentional tampering. The forensics report was signed by a doctor labeled D. Walsh. Elijah searched the personnel database and found that Dr. Walsh had retired more than a year before the file's creation. Using the name of someone no longer in the system suggested a forger seeking a non-responsive identity. They had chosen a name that could no longer be anything. The technician continued to probe the software used for editing. It turned out to be part of a proprietary system reserved for internal medical record alterations, licensed to select private institutions under contract. No administrative clerk could access such tools. Only someone trained, authorized, and well-versed in legal forgery could do this. Elijah underlined the note: formally valid modification, substantively unlawful. Oh, he recorded each critical element in a private notebook: file creation date, mismatched signature, missing blood sample, restricted editing software. Each fact was a cut, small but sharp. Taken together, they painted not a picture of incompetence but of collusion and orchestrated cover-up with internal access and a clear target. Marcus had once been a young soldier, sent to prison over a vague accusation, then labeled a suicide in a place where no one bore witness. But his death had never been fully written. It had been forced into a conclusion, printed, stamped, and shelved like part of a clean administrative process. When Camille Turner was arrested, that same file was resurrected, reconstructed, and digitized almost as if it was being staged for something repeating itself. Elijah closed his eyes and visualized 2 names connected by a straight line: Marcus, whose death had been distorted, and Camille, who now stood trial, beneath a sentence written in advance. Between them lay hundreds of papers that appeared legitimate but had been shaped by unseen hands. This was not an accidental recurrence. It was designed. He pulled out his phone, took a photo of the forged signature, and placed it next to Marcus's portrait on the growing investigation board. The system didn't kill Marcus with bullets. It killed him with documents, and if left unchecked, it would do the same to Camille. Elijah tapped his desk twice, affirming the shape of an instinct now made certain. This case had no first victim. Only the last survivor is left to tell the story. Lorna's house sat deep inside a narrow street, still and untouched, as if time had halted the day Marcus died. Elijah knocked, holding the folder close. Afternoon light stretched across the cracked steps. She opened the door, her face older than the photo she had once attached to her complaint, but her voice remained steady. "What did you find?" She didn't ask why, didn't need pleasantries. Elijah took a seat and laid the papers across the worn wooden table. Deleted lab results, forged signature, restricted software, mismatched date sheet thudded down like stones refilling a grave that had been prematurely unearthed. She read every page. Her hands trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. When Elijah presented the final blood analysis, she placed her hand on her son's photo, her voice cracking through the silence. "I used to think silence was how I protected him from being defamed. Now I understand silence is how they win." Her words weren't loud, but they cut through the air. Elijah slid forward the petition to reopen the case. She read it once, asked nothing, then signed. "I'll be a witness, and I'll say the thing they wanted me to forget." She spoke of the last night Marcus called. His voice was short, urgent, but composed. "If something happens to me, don't let them write my story. You remember who I am, Mom. You do." Elijah wrote down every word. Each sentence felt like evidence from a war no one had ever truly survived. News of Lorna's signature spread swiftly across the veteran community. Around the same time, Elijah received an anonymous email. The sender address traced back to a decommissioned internal system from a prison medical network once linked to Eastbridge. The message confirmed past observations of special patient transfers moved outside camera range into isolated exam zones not logged through regular procedures. Marcus's name appeared in those records. Camille had just been moved into that same location. History wasn't repeating by chance. It was being orchestrated for those deemed too dangerous. Media outlets began reintroducing Marcus Delaney's name, not as a line lost in suicide statistics, but as a story reclaimed. Articles drew comparisons between the original report and the new evidence Elijah had compiled. Every paragraph struck at the reputation of Eastbridge, a prison built to detain and monitor people, but somehow incapable of monitoring their deaths. That afternoon, at a community town hall hosted by a veterans group, Lorna unexpectedly stepped onto the stage. She moved forward after the moderator finished calling for speakers. No microphone, no spotlight, just a folded letter in her hand. She opened it slowly. It was the final letter Marcus had written her from inside. "Mom, if I don't come home, tell them how I left. Don't let them write the ending." Her voice wavered, each word unsteady, but the room remained completely still. No one left. Eyes, phones, handsaw were fixed on a mother who had once chosen silence. Now, she stood for her son, and for people like Camille, still hoping to survive. Elsewhere, in the prison yard, Camille was brought out for exercise. She looked up. The sky was calm. Sunlight pushed through the bars, casting long, sharp shadows across the ground. Behind her, the guard's footsteps echoed, but in her mind was a voice she had never heard directly, low and resolute, words read from a letter never addressed to her, yet echoing with purpose like a command. The dead were speaking, and Camille, the one still breathing, could no longer look back. Elijah leaned in toward the screen, his eyes pausing on a blank section of the detention center's technical schematic. On the digitized blueprint, every section had an identifying code and a corresponding internal camera except for one area labeled simply as Zone X. He scrolled up and down, cross-referencing with equipment inspection reports, but found no trace of signal routes or any recorded footage from that zone. The deeper he searched, the more disturbing details emerged. 3 inmates, all previously listed in the detention log, were marked as urgently transferred after being placed in Zone X, with no accompanying explanation or medical clearance. When Elijah brought up the name during his next meeting with Camille, her expression shifted, a barely perceptible blink, the reflex of someone who had survived being buried by silence. Camille confirmed that she had been taken to Zone X exactly 3 days after her psychological assessment. She recounted the experience in a steady, detached tone, like someone reading from a formal report note, trembling. No bitterness. A sterile white room, 4 seamless walls, a low ceiling, and no windows. She had been held in absolute silence, without light, without explanation. When she knocked on the door, or called out, no one responded. She couldn't remember how long she stayed awake, only that someone appeared just as she was about to collapse, handed her a single oval-shaped pill without packaging or words. What followed was a fog of confusion and disorientation. When she came to, she was in another isolation wing, with a file that said simply, "Monitoring Post-Neural Response." A chill ran down Elijah's spine. Nothing Camille described existed in any official report. Quietly, he began searching a closed medical forum once used by interns, and there he found an anonymous post detailing an experience eerily similar to Camille's. The author was a former nursing intern, assigned briefly to a basement room with no surveillance and no formal documentation. The post read, "I was instructed not to ask questions, not to take notes, just stabilize the disoriented cases before returning them to the official record." Some later disappeared from the inmate list without anyone knowing where they went. Elijah traced the anonymous account and sent a brief email introducing himself as the attorney representing Camille Turner. Nearly half a day later, a single reply arrived. "If she was ever locked in there and survived, she needs protection immediately. Don't trust the internal detention logs." He reached for his notebook and wrote in bold, precise strokes, a line that carried a chill. Zone X, the room without records. Strong correlation to concealed suicide incidents. It was the first time Elijah admitted to himself that this was no longer just a wrongful imprisonment case. It was a mechanism designed to erase human presence. He looked up, the office light casting a glare on the file, and beneath that ominous line, he wrote one more clause. "Request independent investigation." "Hi." Camille met Elijah's gaze, calm but darker than usual. Her voice came slowly, uninterrupted, as if each word had been refined by long memory. "I never told anyone this, not even the military doctor," she began. In that room I found a small piece of metal, probably from an old hinge. I used it to scratch my arm, not to harm myself, just lightly, so I could write 3 letters on the floor. Alive. She paused, lips pressed together. Alive proof of survival. In case anyone ever walked in, I wanted them to see I was still there, still conscious, still fighting. The next morning, when she woke up, the floor was spotless. The blood was gone. The metal shard had vanished. No one entered. No one said anything. But Camille knew someone had seen it, and someone had tried to erase it. Elijah said nothing, just nodded. He returned to his office and immediately requested maintenance records for Zone X on the day Camille was taken in. On the shift roster, the name Luther Hodge appeared, a man previously accused of inmate abuse in another state, never prosecuted, merely reassigned. Under his work notes, one line stood out: emergency floor cleaning, room 3. A perfect match to Camille's description, but with no stated reason. Elijah cross-checked data from other states and uncovered multiple complaints referencing rooms without cameras and memory loss after drug administration. The pattern was disturbingly consistent. When he next met Camille, Elijah asked directly, his tone grave, "If you had to speak publicly, recount exactly what happened in that room. Are you ready?" Without hesitation, Camille answered, "If I survived that place, I have no reason to stay silent." She sat down, opened a paper notebook, and began to write. No lawyers, no journalists, just her own words. Her handwriting was steady and firm. She described the room, the sense of time, the voices she overheard through the wall, the unlabeled pill, and the bloody message she tried to leave as proof she had existed in that space. At the end of her statement, she wrote, "If they can wipe away the blood, it doesn't mean they've erased the truth." Elijah carefully attached the full report, along with a scanned copy of Camille's handwritten testimony, to an urgent case file. In the folder sent to the federal special investigator, he gave it a clear heading, Testimony from Zone X. No one had ever spoken out from that place before, but this time, a survivor had chosen to speak, and she would not allow the story to be buried in darkness again. Elijah stared at the title on the outgoing file and whispered to himself, "From here on, the system must listen." Elijah had just ended a call with the federal investigative team when the reception buzzer sounded. He wasn't expecting anyone this late. As he stepped out of his office, the first thing he saw was a wrinkled gray police uniform with the badge removed and a face both familiar and unsettling. Glenn Moyer, the deputy chief, stood with dark circles under his eyes and a file bag in hand, his gaze more resolute than Elijah had ever seen. "What are you doing here?" Elijah asked coldly, blocking the entrance. "I need to talk." "Just once," Moyer said quietly. The meeting room felt denser as the door closed behind them. Elijah stood with arms crossed, his eyes sharp. "Are you here for Huxley, or to warn me off?" "I'm here as someone who stayed silent too long," Moyer replied, voice dry and firm. He set the file bag on the table, pulled out a USB, and a stack of documents. "I used to believe that for this system to survive, silence was necessary. I signed off, approved, and looked the other way, not for money, not for glory, but because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my rank, my family, everything I had after 20 years in uniform." His eyes dropped to the table as he exhaled heavily. Elijah didn't respond, just pulled out a chair and sat down, his eyes fixed on Moyer. "When I heard Camille was being forced into a mental evaluation, and when I found out Lucy Langley had been silenced because of a recording she accidentally captured, I realized I couldn't stay in the middle anymore. I've lived on the line between right and wrong, but now I've crossed too far into the wrong side." Moyer slid the USB toward Elijah, then spread the documents out. "There's a 32-minute audio file. It's a closed-door meeting between Huxley and several regional commanders. You'll hear instructions to falsify reports, frame Camille, even plans to move her before the trial." Elijah flipped through the document's handwritten notes, internal directives, shift schedules, meeting transcripts, all authenticated by the department. One page stopped him. Moyer had written, "I signed knowing it was wrong. I will take responsibility." "I'm not here for forgiveness," Moyer continued, voice lower. "I came to stop this. If Camille spends one more night in that cell, I'll never sleep again." Elijah looked at him for a long time, then gave a slight nod. "Will you testify?" he asked. If you need me, I'll be there. Moyer stood, picked up his cap, but held it in his hand rather than wearing it, like a symbol laid down. He paused at the door and turned back. I don't know if this confession will change anything, but at least when the truth is spoken, I won't be a coward. The yellow light over the table flickered against the papers like a blurred reflection of memory. On the screen, the audio file began. A crackle, then a familiar deep voice, Clayton Huxley's. She's military? Even better. Let the public see it. Eastbridge law outranks the army. Laughter followed, dry and smug. Another voice suggested adjusting the cameras in Sector B, like last month. A third replied, templates ready, just change the date. There was a rhythm to their words, cold, repetitive, professional-like, something they'd done dozens of times. Then Huxley again, sharper this time. If she talks, I'll send her to Whitestone. Even soldiers there learned to shut up. The tone, the phrasing, the silence after Elijah knew this wasn't a spontaneous threat. It was a tactic, a deliberate, prejudiced, systematized into control. Another section played, a conversation between Huxley and someone referred to as P. From the content, Elijah guessed it was the prosecutor. Reduce the charges, but keep the sentence wide enough to scare her. What about the clip the little girl recorded? Handled. Her father knows what to do. Elijah stopped the recording, leaned back in his chair, his heartbeat loud in the silence. There was no doubt left. This wasn't misconduct, it was a blueprint. A machinery of manipulation designed to bend truth, twist justice, and crush those who dared to stand upright. He rose, moved to the evidence board, and named down names, timelines, and actions. Each quote was linked by red arrows to confirmed facts. Moyer's statement, forged medical records, and fake system reports from a fired technician. 3 key witnesses circled in red: Camille's military physician, the teacher who received Lucy's audio, and Moyer himself. Outside, the night pressed against the windows. The office was empty except for the ticking clock, each second echoing the tension of the trial to come. Elijah stood at the window, looking out over the town, cloaked in black. The truth is speaking now, Camille. No one can silence it anymore, he whispered. Then he returned to the desk and played the final segment. The speaker hissed with darkness, and a tired voice spoke, not sharp, not calculated. I'm no hero. I just couldn't take it anymore. The screen went dark, but in Elijah's mind, a door had swung open. Tomorrow, he would bring that tape into the light, not with pleas, but with truths no one could deny. The parking lot behind the old fire station sat dimly under a flickering high-pressure lamp. Elijah slowed as he spotted the woman leaning against a large metal dumpster, cap pulled low, a worn police jacket draped over her shoulders. She didn't turn around, but her voice rang out, clear and cold. I figured you wouldn't come. Elijah paused mid-step. You didn't leave a name. The woman turned her head. Beneath the brim, her eyes gave her away instantly. Naomi Rhodes, former deputy inspector for Eastbridge Police Internal Affairs, who had vanished from the personnel list after an internal investigation 3 years ago. I've been following Camille's case since the beginning, Naomi said, her voice steady. I didn't speak up because I knew my words wouldn't change anything, but I kept my old habits, recording, listening, keeping the links. Elijah stepped closer, his hands loose at his sides, though his eyes never left hers. She handed him a thick envelope. Inside was a printed sheet with an address, storage code, and a few handwritten lines. The camera outside the shop where Camille was arrested wasn't broken. That system has an automatic backup cycle that stores each recording for 72 hours before overwriting. It's not managed by patrol, but by internal technical staff. The former operator's name was Jared Cole. Elijah scanned the codes. I've never heard of him. He was forced out 3 months ago for refusing to delete a video from a police intervention at a town hall meeting. After that, his file was sealed. Jared might be hard to reach, but if you can, he's the only one who can decode the original footage. The wind howled between the concrete walls. Elijah looked directly at Naomi. Why are you helping me now? Naomi stayed quiet for a few seconds, then said softly, the Marcus Delaney case was assigned to me. He was a veteran. I suspected an unlisted isolation unit, but when I filed the report, it was buried. I got reassigned, and Marcus died 3 days later. She lowered her gaze, her voice heavier. I couldn't save Marcus. I've been living quietly, pretending I couldn't have done more. but when I heard Camille call out someone's name while being dragged away, I went back to the radio log. Her eyes, I've seen that look once before, and it never left me. Elijah folded the sheet and slipped it into his coat. I'll find Jared. If that footage is still alive, I'll pull it out. Naomi stepped back, gripping the dumpster rail behind her. I won't go with you, but I'll warn you now, what you're about to expose won't just bring down Huxley. It'll shake the very foundations of this town. Before she turned away, she glanced back at Elijah through the shadows. If you get that footage, justice won't have to wait for anyone's permission this time. The apartment was tucked between weathered suburban homes, surrounded by faded wooden fences and brittle potted plants. Elijah parked out front, eyes scanning the tangled web of DIY surveillance cameras mounted across the porch. After a few knocks, the metal door creaked open. A man with disheveled hair, scruffy beard, and wrinkled sweatshirt squinted at Elijah through dusty glasses. Jared Cole, once an internal systems technician for Eastbridge, now lived among piles of computer towers, loose circuit boards, and flickering monitors. Naomi said I could trust you, Elijah began. Jared studied him a moment longer before stepping aside to let him in. The main room lacked any seating for guests, just two parallel tables covered in hard drives, old servers, and dismantled motherboards. Jared sat in a swivel chair, powered up a large monitor, and pulled out a gray steel drive. I knew someone would ask about this one day. He opened it, revealing a sealed device labeled Loop Record, Zone C2. Jared typed in a command. A security interface appeared. He entered a triple-layer access code. That camera wasn't broken. It was overwritten, intentionally. They used a 10-second loop, inserted over the time Camille appeared. I kept the original as a secondary backup, never uploaded to the central server. He hit enter, and lines of code began to run. The footage emerged slowly, pixels fractured, colors bleeding. The first section's badly corrupted. I had to write a custom decoder. Elijah watched in silence as Jared worked for nearly 2 hours. Each step seemed guided by memory and instinct, an expert once forced out of the system, now reconstructing its cracks from within. Jared's eyes never left the screen, fingers tapping fast, sweat beading on his forehead as the final frames rendered. On screen, Camille appeared in frame, rushing to support Edith, who had collapsed on the steps. She knelt, helping her sit on a wooden bench, hand placed behind the elderly woman as if shielding her from the light. No shouting, no struggle. A police officer entered from the left. Within 5 seconds, he had forced Camille down, locking her arms behind her head and calling on the radio. Her face was pressed against the pavement, just enough angle to show Edith's panicked expression. Jared paused the video, enlarging the frame by frame. If I had more time, I could trace the override command back to its issuing device, maybe even track the last access account. Elijah nodded. I need 3 copies encrypted, one for me, one for a federal attorney, and one filed with the federal notary system before we go public. Jared handed him a matte black USB. Once this gets out, Huxley won't be the only one falling. The central surveillance unit will have to answer, and if they choose to wipe everything, you better be at least 1 step ahead. Elijah left the apartment as night fell, a breeze carrying the scent of someone's stovetop fire through the early summer air. In the car, he pulled the USB from his pocket, turning it slowly between his fingers like a fragile shard of truth. They erased her image from the system, he whispered, eyes fixed on the highway ahead. Now that image will be the thing that erases theirs. The solitary confinement cell had 3 concrete walls, a small window barred with dusty steel rods, and a ceiling light so bright it stung the eyes. Camille sat against the far corner, back straight, eyes fixed on the black-covered notebook open in front of her. A broken pencil, sharpened with a plastic cap, left bold, even lines as if each letter were a command to be followed with military precision. Each line recorded a silence that had been forced. She didn't write stories or add flowery details. Each person got exactly 1 line, just like entries in a military log. Male, white, left arm broken, mumbled his mother's name 3 times in his sleep. Female, red hair, cried for 4 days, sang on the 5th. The silent man with no name drew circles on the wall every morning, vanished after the 2nd week. Camille didn't know their names, but remembered every detail. That was the one thing the system hadn't been able to strip from the mind of a soldier who had survived a war zone. Each thin page bore the mark of the prison's recycled air, and the sweat pooled between calloused palms. At one point, she paused longer than usual, writing just 3 words: Marcus Delaney. No other explanation followed. That name alone was enough, clear, silent, and abandoned in a way that required no footnote. She turned the page, continuing to document the nameless souls glimpsed through steel slits, in mirror reflections, or echoing cries from neighboring cells. When she reached the last page, her hand moved slowly, each stroke hitting the paper like a nail being driven. If I don't make it out, say my name right. Sergeant Camille Turner, Marine, not an inmate. There was no signature, no date. She didn't need to mark a time. What she left behind was the clarity of thought and the truth unadorned. The sound of a lock turned. A guard entered, carrying a metal tray of dinner. He looked tired, his shirt damp, but his steps remained steady, his eyes glancing silently through the viewing slot. As he set the tray down, his gaze lingered for a few seconds on the notebook placed neatly by her pillow. The cover bore an engraving made with the pencil's hardened tip. For those remembered, the letters were worn, marked with a shallow scratch, but still bold as a quiet warning. Camille didn't look at him, and didn't rush to eat. She remained still, eyes on the blank wall in front of her, calculating distance, waiting for a signal no one else could detect. Nothing in the room moved, yet the air thickened like a night march where no one dares speak. She picked up the plastic spoon, eating cold rice spoonful by spoonful, slowly, undisturbed. Her back stayed straight, neck never dipped too low, her gaze leveled forward, as if tracking the edge between captivity and trial. Outside, lights shut down section by section. Wind hissed through iron slits, making the window bars tremble like a signal only someone from the trenches would understand. Camille remained seated, eyes open, but her mind had long escaped the concrete cage. She was standing among those forgotten, carrying their stories into a battle she hadn't asked for, but never avoided. Each line she wrote was a flag planted, a marker that they had existed, that they had suffered, and none of them deserved to be buried in silence. The scent of ink and dry paper still hung in the office when Elijah closed the final case file and moved his cold coffee aside. He had planned to leave before midnight, but footsteps at reception interrupted him. A young woman handed him a brown envelope, looking uncertain. Someone dropped this off, said it must go directly to you. No address. Elijah took it, nodded a quick thanks, eyes already locked on the handwritten words in black ink. Private, hand delivery. Inside was a cleanly cut sheet of white paper, uncreased and bare. One line printed in the center read, "If you continue, no one will save you." He stared at the note, eyes fixed on the empty space around the warning. No fingerprints. No pen pressure, no logo, no perfume, no trace of carelessness. A message crafted with surgical precision. He sat back in his chair, fingers steepled against his mouth. Faces from the past 6 weeks cycled through his mind. Informants, data handlers, witnesses, veterans, even the silent messengers from backstage. He opened his encrypted laptop, updated a private tracking file, and marked 6 possible leak points, each one categorized by access level and vulnerability. The sender wasn't threatening his life, but targeting his resolve. It was a tactic familiar to anyone who'd challenged institutional power, intimidate just enough to cause hesitation. Elijah didn't call the police or turn to a witness protection agency. Instead, he activated a backup encryption vault, creating a 3rd copy of all Camille's case files, this time on an air-gapped system. 2 hard copies were written, sealed, and tagged with unique codes. One went to military attorney Sofia Rodriguez, the other to the Department of Defense's Veterans Center, an institution known for protecting whistleblowers from within military systems. He refused to let the weight fall solely on his shoulders. He slid the note into a plastic sleeve, sealed it with heat, then affixed it inside the case file cover. On it, he scribbled a line, "They warned me, but gave me more reason." No period, no capital letter, a clause left open because he wasn't finished. Before leaving, Elijah glanced back at the photo on the wall, a grainy print from an old newspaper, showing Camille Turner in formal military dress, slight shoulders squared, eyes locked forward. Her face didn't smile, but carried a calm so steady it refused to be ignored, like someone who had foreseen the storm and chose not to step away. He buttoned his coat, slipped the encrypted folder into his inner pocket. Outside, rain had begun to fall. As he walked out, the office door shut quietly behind him. Lights dimmed down the hallway, darkness folding in like the start of a courtroom that offered no retreat. In his pocket, the file remained still, not just documents, but the sum of everything Camille had endured in silence, and now that silence was ready to speak. The morning at the federal courthouse felt compressed into a single, breathless moment. Every seat was filled, from veterans and families of victims once abused in Eastbridge to uniformed military officers adorned with stars. When the main door opened, all eyes turned to the woman walking in slowly. Camille Turner wore a white shirt, no longer in the orange prison uniform, no handcuffs. The decision to allow her to appear freely after the council deemed the preliminary evidence substantial had stirred quiet waves in public opinion. Judge Samuel Richardson struck the gavel, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. His voice was firm and steady. This hearing does not exist solely to determine the guilt of one individual. It exists to examine the legitimacy of the system that entangled her. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, must withstand the light of truth. Oh, Elijah Grant stood. He began with an audio recording, the voice of a little girl breaking through the silence. Dad said to delete it, or they'll come take my device. The air shifted instantly. It was the voice of Lucy Langley, granddaughter of Edith Langley, who had been present when Camille was arrested. The recording continued, capturing a conversation between Lucy's father, Officer Dennis Langley, and Huxley. A gravelly voice, issuing orders like threats, said, "Wipe it all. The footage, the statements, even the girl. If this leaks, the fund closes." The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the audio ended. The judge ordered verification. The investigative bureau confirmed the recording was unaltered, the timestamp aligned, and the content was admissible, since it had been captured naturally, without coercion. This proves manipulation originated within the police family, the very place meant to safeguard the truth, Elijah said calmly, each word anchoring itself into the wooden floor. An elderly man stood at the back. Dr. Charles Whitmore, a former military physician and current clinical director at Virginia's military hospital, was called as the next witness. Looking directly at Camille, then to the judge, he said, "I treated Miss Turner after the Ramadi campaign. She showed no signs of PTSD, no instability. She was the last steady presence in her unit." Elijah placed on the table the recent medical records from Eastbridge Jail, which described Camille as paranoid and recommended psychiatric evaluation. Whitmore reviewed them and pointed out three major discrepancies. The exam date was shifted, the prescription name altered, and the signature belonged to someone without a military medical license. "This isn't a clerical error. This is fabricated documentation," he concluded. The judge studied the file carefully. Who authorized a psychiatric evaluation without a court order? The question was not aimed at anyone specific, but the silence in the room signaled the collective pressure bearing down on everyone. The prosecution requested a recess to reassess procedural conduct. Elijah objected without hesitation. "They don't need more time to find the truth. They need more time to hide it." Camille asked to speak. For the first time since her arrest, she rose in open court. "I'm not here to beg. I was isolated, jailed, judged through glances and bias, but what they fear most isn't me. It's my silence. Because silence, when held long enough, becomes its own kind of evidence." Amid rising murmurs, Judge Samuel ordered Eastbridge Jail to immediately submit its internal surveillance log from the day Camille was placed in solitary. From this moment on, not only Miss Turner's words will be investigated. Every report, every transfer, every security clip will be reviewed, just as she was, he declared. The room quieted again, But this time, the silence spoke louder than any outburst. Elijah activated the main screen in the center. The video began playing, unedited, with no distortion or skipped frames like those previously released by police. It showed a frail woman collapsing outside a shop, her groceries scattering. Camille ran from afar, bent down to assist, using one hand to support the shoulder and the other to hold the wrist, guiding her to a bench. No force, no threatening behavior, no aggression. Edith Langley stood, her voice trembling but clear. I slipped. She was the only one who helped while everyone else walked by. What the police said about her is completely false. She didn't glance at the prosecution, only at Camille, nodding slowly. Elijah then presented the technical analysis of prior footage, showing how the original had been darkened, mistimed, and had a key 3-second transition cut precisely the moment Camille reached Edith. An independent analyst confirmed, this isn't accidental, this is intentional editing to alter the nature of the act captured. Tension shifted as Glenn Moyer stepped onto the witness stand, pale and clutching a page. He began slowly, then played a 30-minute audio clip from a personal device. Huxley's voice echoed, "Put her in solitary. If she talks, Cross and Langston follow. We lose everything." The video's cleaned, but delete the cache at the store too. Moyer paused to breathe. I did what I was told. I ordered the reports rewritten, pressured the medical staff to revise psychiatric notes. I knew she was innocent, but if someone like her gets heard, the whole system collapses. He lowered his head. The silence that followed was the weight of a man confessing his role in orchestrating a lie. Naomi Rhodes followed by presenting a confidential directive she had secretly copied, missing from official archives. It instructed Eastbridge forces to increase security metrics via tactical arrests and suppress military and federal dissent through soft measures. Simultaneously, Elijah displayed financial records revealing how arrest spikes for black individuals coincided with increased Homeland Security grants. Arrest rates were unusually high, especially among newcomers and those with military histories. Like a hand peeling back one mask after another, Elijah connected the dots from Lucy's recording to the falsified medical records, the raw video, Moyer's confession, and Naomi's internal memo. A map of systemic power emerged in court, where authority did not lie in the law, but in control of information, manipulation of fear, and forced disappearance of truth. Judge Samuel sat upright. He closed the file, laid down his pen, and looked at the court as if only he and Camille remained. His voice wasn't loud, but heavier than any indictment. This court is not merely deciding whether Camille Turner is guilty. It is deciding whether we can still call this justice. Camille's expression remained neutral, but everyone in the room understood this was no longer about proving her innocence. It was about demanding that those who buried the truth explain why they ever believed they would never be caught. The courtroom was silent. Many assumed the trial was near its end, awaiting only Judge Samuel's verdict, but he paused, set down his gavel, and announced a brief recess. A military advisor has requested to introduce a final witness, he said, closing his file with an unreadable expression. The double doors opened. A man in a white and blue-trimmed uniform entered, bearing 4 silver stars on his shoulders. General Victor Langston walked without a guard, head high, eyes forward, stopping before Camille's row. Their eyes met. No words were spoken, but something passed between them, an unspoken recognition of pain that needed no explanation. Langston stood tall, saluted sharply, then lowered his hand and bowed his head. The room held its breath. A 4-star general was honoring a former soldier accused without proof. Camille didn't respond with a smile or nod. Her gaze reflected the weight of the gesture, acknowledging it without clinging to it. Facing the judge, Langston spoke with clarity. I testify not for Camille Turner, but for the system that was meant to protect her. Judge Samuel allowed his statement under witness protection. Langston removed his cap and began. He recounted the Ramadi mission. Camille, at 26, stayed behind voluntarily to cover her unit's retreat. For nearly 6 hours, she held position alone. No communication, no backup, just her rifle and a photo of her mother inside her vest. If she hadn't done that, Langston said, I wouldn't be here to bow. The courtroom froze. Langston continued, eyes on the prosecutors. Many in the military knew who she was. They stayed silent not out of doubt, but to protect political standing in a town they'd never enter. They let a soldier drown in bureaucracy. His voice remained calm, but every word cut deep. We've let the word justice become a tool, not a place for dignity. I failed by not speaking sooner. From his pocket, he took out a sealed envelope marked with the Department of Defense seal. He handed it to Camille. Inside is confirmation of your service, an unissued commendation, and one final line from my office. Your abandonment was systemic failure. It does not reflect your worth. Langston sat upright in the front row, cap on his lap, no longer a commander, just a soldier bearing witness. Judge Samuel turned to the prosecution. If there's any objection, speak now. Otherwise, the court will consider Miss Turner's resistance justified given the violations revealed. No one responded. Those who once led the charge against her now lowered their eyes. Silence returned not out of fear or hesitation, but as a long overdue act of recognition, and for the first time, the truth belonged to the one who had lived it. Judge Richardson placed his hand on the desk, his voice low and steady as he spoke. The court finds Camille Turner not guilty and calls for a criminal investigation into all parties involved in her arrest and detention. The courtroom fell silent. No applause, no tears. Elijah bowed his head. Camille remained composed, offering only a quiet nod, as if she'd always known justice would have to face her eventually. To the left, Huxley stood pale as a judicial officer approached and cuffed him without resistance. The man who once ordered Camille's confinement now lowered his head, blending into a line of others, deputies, wardens, medical staff, all exposed by the trial's unraveling truths. Outside, Camille's name spread across headlines, and phones lit up with alerts. Elijah received a call from the Department of Justice. A special investigation unit was being formed. Eastbridge was the starting point, not the end. Elijah was asked to submit everything: records, witness statements, and hidden cases linked by the same flawed system. A memo he received later revealed years of wrongful reports, unexplained deaths, and inflated budgets. At the center stood Camille's name, not as a victim, but as the catalyst. When Camille stepped out of the courthouse, reporters surged forward. She paused, scanned their faces, then shook her head and said nothing. A faint smile crossed her lips, not from relief, but as a quiet closure. She turned and walked into the crowd alone, her dignity intact. No bodyguards, no politicians, only the weight of truth now carried in plain sight. Elijah, standing afar, held a sealed file. The first page bore a handwritten note. No one is a silent prisoner anymore. Looking up, he saw Camille's figure disappear behind the square, upright, calm, each step a silent reckoning. Camille visited a quiet cemetery, standing before a weather-worn gravestone. It bore the name of someone who once told her, "If you survive, live like you still have a mission." She touched the stone gently, placed a folded page from her solitary confinement beside it, written in darkness, when silence had been heavier than chains. Behind her came soft footsteps. Without turning, she knew it was Edith Langley, arm in arm with her granddaughter Lucy. The child approached with a crayon drawing of Camille helping an old woman, surrounded by smiling faces. No blood, no police, just a moment of kindness the world had tried to criminalize. Camille smiled gently, ruffled Lucy's hair. Edith sat down by the church bench once used by women fighting for the right to vote. "This time, they'll have to listen," she whispered toward the horizon. That night, in her mother's old room, Camille opened a sealed envelope from the federal team. She wrote her first letter to them, not about herself, but about those never named. She denied requests, invisible bruises, and missing prisoners. At the end, she wrote, "I never asked for forgiveness. I asked to be acknowledged. I speak not for my pain, but for those who died with no one left to speak." She attached a handwritten list of names, not in order, but from memory, like soldiers remembering their fallen. Looking into the mirror, Camille saw herself clearly for the first time since prison. Her military ID had been returned, her file scrubbed of lies, her dark coat laid on the table. She touched the mirror's edge, as if feeling something deeper than reflection. Her face was the same, but her eyes were no longer hidden behind silence or rage. They belonged to someone who had moved beyond being a victim, but had never stopped being a soldier. Without weapons, Camille had become a living testimony. The next morning, a short article ran in a local paper. Camille Turner, appointed as honorary advisor to the Federal Investigation Unit on illegal detentions. No front page, no photo. But for those who had once remained silent, it was unmistakable this time. They had to listen. Some people survive battlefields only to be treated as criminals at home. Camille's story reveals how assumptions and reports can destroy honor faster than war. She reminds us not to judge from a file or a second-hand opinion. True worth is in silent strength, in those who protect the truth even when it's easier to betray it. Have you ever been misjudged by someone who never knew you? Have you ever been overlooked only to prove you were far more than they imagined? If this story made you pause, share it with someone. And don't forget to follow for more stories about truth, dignity, and courage.